This episode is going to be a slight departure from what you may have come to expect from VoiceHead being, this nonstop rah-rah for, 80s hard rock vocals. The show was intended to be more general, more kind of incorporate acting technique and all kinds of different forms of vocal communication. Although I love 80s hard rock, and it's a hard skill. It's a difficult skill to do it well. So I appreciate the challenge of that. But anyway, forget all about that. Today, I'm going to make you a better storyteller by teaching you about the faculties, the techniques, the options that you have as a storyteller. Part of this is because I'm going into book 2 of the author A.D. Greer's novel, Legends of Eld, which I highly recommend. I'm narrating book 2 right now. I highly recommend checking out book 1. I narrated that one, did like 70 plus different characters. And so there's nothing that I love more than just kind of like any sort of art form where there's like jumping between different characters. It's kind of a lost art. There's no Mel Blanc types working really in Hollywood anymore, because there's so many people there that you can really just kind of pick and choose and find the best person for the best role. And there's so many talented people chomping at the bit. But audiobook is still this kind of template where you can really kind of, if the work supports it, you can really kind of go ham with all kinds of different characters. And then even if you're just like telling a joke or you're giving a speech, if you can set up the different characters, through your vocal communication faculties, then you can become a better storyteller and more engaging and keep eyeballs. And if there's one thing that's more important in this economy now than ever before, it's getting eyeballs and keeping eyeballs. So I'm going to help you get and keep earballs as well as eyeballs through different kinds of technique for creating characters, keeping them distinct, and also allowing flexibility within those characters to feel a whole range of human emotions and carry them while kind of guarding the character that they are. So what are some ways that we as narrators or storytellers, what are some of the tools that we have to keep characters distinct? Well, I think the most obvious one would be pitch, right? Let's go to the park. I don't want to go to the park. No, let's go to the park. I don't want to go to the park. Let's go to the park. So that would be it's easy to see who's character A, who's character B without too much setup, right? One of them talks very high, the other one talks very low. Now, what's one of the struggles with using pitch as your main way to split characters apart and create two different characters? Well, the biggest problem is when these characters are in, say, an argument or anything that becomes very, very emotional. What happens? Let's go to the park. I don't want to go to the park. I really want to go to the park. I don't want to go to the park. I really want to go to the park. I don't want to go to the park. I want to go to the park. I don't want to go to the park. As they get more emotional, their pitch goes up. So pretty soon you can't tell these characters apart. So we need to develop more things in our toolkits than just, modifying pitch. So what's another thing that you can modify that's like pretty easy? Pace. Pace is a great way to separate characters. If all of your characters are talking at the same pace, it's just not very true to life, right? People speak at vastly different speeds. I feel like the age of the internet is kind of over-indexing the very, very fast talkers. Most of the people who are able to get and hold lots and lots of attention are people who speak very, very, very fast, right? And so one thing that's interesting is that you can actually tell how a person processes the world by the pace at which they speak. You can tell how a character either sees or hears or feels the world most strongly based on the speed at which they talk. So probably, as I've heard from like studying like NLP, like 80% of the world are visual people. Visual people talk the fastest. Maybe 80% is a little high, but more than 50% are definitely visual people, and they talk very fast. Why do visual people talk very fast? Because visual people are they're getting hit with images coming into their head, and in order to keep up with the images, they speak very, very fast. So they're very visual, and light's the fastest moving thing on the planet, right? So that means that that kind of informs that visual people speak the fastest. Auditory people speak a little bit more slowly. They want to make sure that everyone is hearing what they're saying, and they want to kind of create a musicality, and music happens through time, right? So generally, auditory people speak at sort of a moderate pace. Now, what about very slow talking people? Very slow talking people are what's known as kinesthetic because they feel things before they speak them. So, a lot of very visual people tend to kind of look down on people who speak slower and be like, oh, they're not quick. They can't keep up. But they have like a different way of processing things. People who are more kinesthetic sort of find people who talk very fast often inauthentic to themselves and how they really feel. So this is an interesting way of just sort of quickly creating a sense of character. If you're doing an audiobook and you want to create 80 different characters, it's if the text sort of allows for that, like you want to kind of make bold choices and do a little bit of running and gunning while making notes and making sure that you're consistent. So this is another great way to give a great sense of who a character is based on how quickly they talk. Also, of course, young people tend to talk very quick and older people tend to talk slower. But again, maybe that's because their vision isn't as good and they're more in touch with their kinesthetic sense in some way. So that all kind of unifies a little bit. Okay, so we've got pitch, we've got pace. What else can we use in order to create character? Well, there's accent, of course. Accent is very tricky. If you're going into something that's fantasy, obviously you can kind of make things up, I mean, it's so kind of canon that like dwarves are Scottish and, elves are, I don't even know, I guess like some kind of high English, Anglo-Saxon accent and, this, that, and the other. Orcs are Cockney, at least in sort of the way Tolkien's been like, created and everybody sort of falls in line with that. So, I mean, you can definitely make bold choices and kind of go a little bit ham. And certainly if you're doing fantasy, you don't have to worry as much about like the authenticity of like, have I gotten this wrong? One thing that's, I'm not going to get into how to do every single accent ever. But one thing that I think is like a little tip that can really, really help is you want to look very often an accent will be like kind of like one overall vowel modification. Let's say you're going from American English to sort of a not London, but a RP, received pronunciation. It's a darker sound, and then there's like key vowels in there, like the biggie I think is can't, instead of can't. Can't. That rhymes in English. It's kind of convenient that they go can't, because you can actually hear the difference. You said you can, you said you can't, right? Another thing is going even darker vowel wise would be like Scottish, right? You got like a Scottish accent is something approximately like this. It's hard to jump into one and then the other and blah, 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 but it's very dark. But you got to be careful because if you overgeneralize, you'll miss how, the E vowel is like brighter than anything in the American English. I think in maybe all the the British Isles, there's nothing as bright as a Scots person going, a wee lad, super forward, super bright. It's sort of iconoclastic with the accent. But if you miss that, then, you kind of miss a big part of the accent and a big part of the character, right? So look for the kind of the general vowel modifications and then look for what's sort of iconoclastic to that general vowel modification. Like if everything's a little bit darker, well, it's very bright. If everything's very bright, like in Australian, what's very dark? I'm trying to think if there's a Nah, that's pretty forward accent. I don't know. Light me up in the comments if I'm missing something. So there's accent, of course. That's a very easy way. Is and what is an accent? More than anything else, it's vowel modifications. Of course, there's some consonant modifications like, shouldn't have done it, governor. Like whatever, the Cockney dropping the glow stops. So of course that would be an example of a consonant, but mostly when you're talking about accents, you're talking about vowel modifications. Okay, so that's a biggie. You can definitely create accents for characters. But let's say you're doing like a crime drama in New York, like you're not just gonna go randomly making people French and Irish if the text doesn't really call for it. Um, you know, so what's like another more subtle way that you can create characters? Oh, here's a great example. Let's say that you've got like a kind of a peas in the pod. In improv comedy, you talk about peas in a pod, like total opposites. That's more easy to create characters for. But what if you've got a couple of characters who are peas in a pod, right? And so you've got like a Tweedledee and a Tweedledum character, and Tweedledee, Tweedledum. Maybe one of them talks slightly higher than the other one. But how are you going to carry that through? Let's say Tweedledee and Tweedledum in your story are having an argument. How do you separate one from the other when they're both kind of twin characters, right? And that's where maybe my favorite way to differentiate characters comes in, and that would be twang or placement. Twang is different from nasality, which we haven't talked about in this. I probably talked about it in other shows because it's a huge part of my teaching and my understanding of how to use your voice. But twang is about placement. When most people talk about something being very, very, very nasal, what they actually mean is it's very, very twangy. Because what's very, very nasal is if you keep your soft palate very, very, very low and you're allowing lots of air to come through the nose. Strangers in the night. The microphone actually loves nasality. Twang, not as much, but there is definitely a time and a place for it. And definitely 80s rock is one of those times and places. If there's a lot of guitars, twang is like the best way to like cut through the din, right? Like, think of like you're at a bar and you hear somebody like, oh my God, and it just cuts through all of the noise of the bar. And you're like, I can't get this person's voice out of my ear. That's twang. And so twang can be a very subtle way to be like, Tweedledee, Tweedledum. That's a little bit extreme, and I was sort of moving the larynx, but Tweedledee, Tweedledum, Tweedledee, Tweedledum, Tweedledee. One of them's forward, one of them's more back. Even though they both kind of talk in the same accents and they both kind of talk like munchkins, one of them has a more forward placement and the other one has a more backward placement. And generally, the one with the higher authority is using a little bit more twang. We could delve into why that is. But basically, twang it's like a little bit irritating, but it's a very, very efficient way to make your voice heard. It's a little annoying, it's a little grating, but it's a very efficient way to make your voice heard. So, when two characters sort of get in their you know, status conflict or whatever, generally the one who has the higher status is going to kind of like gain permission to be a little bit twangier than the one who is more submissive. And so this is a kind of a great tool in your toolkit. Twang, you got to know about twang. You got to know it's different from nasality. You talk about nasality versus having them raising the soft palate a little bit. To go extreme, you get sort of like a Artie, the strongest man in the world. That's a super random Pete and Pete 90s reference. A little bit Dudley Do-Right, a little bit, it's sort of how you would be trained to speak with elocution classes, to go extreme with that. And then to go really, really nasal, you get into a parody of sort of doing like a Godfather thing, you sort of a Marlon Brando. It's an extremely nasal voice. And one of the reasons that was so kind of mind-blowing on the scene of American actors is because it was the opposite of how like any sort of trained acting professional would talk. They'd be trained to, speak for the stage, to communicate like this. Part of that is to raise the soft palate, drop the larynx a little bit in order to create a large pharyngeal resonance chamber so that you can speak in a very proud, pleasant tone and communicate to a whole theater.
Right, and he would do the opposite of this, but nasality sounds really, really quite pleasant on the microphone.
So as we went into the medium of film, Marlon Brando was a real innovator. And his nasal voice was a big part of that. He wasn't twangy, but he was very nasal. Okay, so nasality, not nasality. What other things can you do to create characterizations?
Characterizations.
You can use your larynx. The larynx, if we haven't talked about it, you're just new to the channel. The larynx is a extremely powerful tool. Generally in singing, it's to communicate style. So you drop your larynx really low, and suddenly you create a character like this. Now this is in the scale that I learned from Justin Stoney. Is you've got -3, -2, -1, 0, neutral larynx, +1, +2, +3. -3 is like, I don't know, boss. That's kind of like a cartoon character. -2 is a little bit more like how you would sing opera. It can be taken seriously, or maybe like a very regal character, sort of a cartoon of a royal character would have a larynx down at a -2 position. -1 larynx would be a little bit more, standard American, well, of course, to do like a what's his name? Who am I doing when I do of course? Cary Grant, of course. He's like a kind of a -1 larynx position, right? Standard American, just a high society person would sort of put their larynx down a little bit and look you in your eye and, have a nice, warm, pleasant communicating style that sounds great on a wide open stage. Maybe if you do that right on a microphone, it sounds a little inauthentic, right? But if you're communicating to a whole theater, it's great. Solid technique. If you go to like classical acting training, they're gonna, whether they know it or not, they're gonna teach you to drop your larynx a little bit, right? Neutral larynx is neutral larynx is neutral larynx. A +1 larynx is a little, kind of working class. You can see that sort of like the higher the larynx gets, a little bit more low class kind of the characterizations become. I don't really know why that is. Maybe it's like an easy way to if you're yelling on a job site, a high larynx sort of induces cortisol, stress, right? A low larynx sort of releases stress, but a high larynx kind of induces stress a little bit, creates strain on the voice. If you're singing on a high larynx, that's no problem. That's kind of the most of what I do. It's super important you drop that larynx. I mean, if you ever see me in a show and I'm like, singing high larynx, at some point when my verse is done and the chorus is done, I'm going to turn around, take the microphone away and go blub, 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 just to like de-stress the larynx and the vocal instrument. But high larynx is great. You get all the way up to 3. What's up, doc? You get like a Bugs Bunny kind of thing. Larynx, great tool. You can be as subtle or as, hit you over the head as you want. Any little difference is changing the shape of the pharynx, the size of the pharynx. It's going to have quite dramatic impact on the sound of your voice. So a little dab will do you, but don't be afraid of the cartoon voices either. Got placement. You've got larynx, you've got pace, you've got pitch, and you've got accent. Sort of tying into accent, you've got musicality versus monotone. The American accent is known for being kind of monotone. If you go somewhere in the world where they don't speak English and they're like, hey, what does English sound like? Usually you're going to hear something like, it's going to be very kind of nasal, kind of high larynx, right? Low class. And very, forward, not nasal, forward, not nasal, forward. And it's going to be very flat. Um, the American accent is very flat. And, if you're going to be like a voice art speaking professional, it's going to be a challenge for you to create more musicality with the American accent without necessarily going, all the way. I have a voice actor friend, and he's telling me that like he's doing a spot in, I think it was Brazil. They wanted an American voice, and he was like, football all day, every day. It's incredible. The joy never stops. And they were like, it's a little flat. It's a little boring. Can you spice it up? He said by the end he's like bleeding from the eyes. But again, it's just a cultural difference. The American accent tends to be very flat. So if you're doing an accent, there tends to be kind of like an emotional set point cluster around an accent. Like one thing is British accent, particularly like an RP, is it's that if you could get all the sounds right, but if you get the culture of it wrong, then it's not gonna read as authentic. So there's a lot of subtleties. I highly recommend a woman named Sandy Small. Shout out to Sandy Small. Go find her on Instagram or on LinkedIn mostly. She does a lot of really cool work with, kind of the subtler points of getting a British accent. But there's sort of like a cheeriness. Hello, good morning. It's a little bit, it can be a little bit, your call is very important to us, and so if you don't get the attitude right, you come in with your American kind of like "Meh" attitude, it might not be able to read as close to the character. Another thing is the 7 different types of rasp and vocal distortion, which we cover in full in a video. So I'm not going to go all the way through the 7 different types of rasp and vocal distortion. But of course, anything that applies to singing in terms of technique also applies to talking. So you can use your false vocal cords. You can do vocal fry. Now you'll find yourself wanting to use false vocal cords more easily unless you elevate your pitch, just because vocal fry down here, unless you got the microphone right there, it doesn't read super well. And you can do this at like a pretty loud volume. So, if you're using false vocal cords, you create kind of like a New York comic sort of thing. There's a million things you can do with this. Vocal fry, twang, we already talked about, and that interfaces with aereo-epiglottic distortion. Breathy, you can be breathy. You can be a very breathy sort of create like an Earth Mother, hippie character. People who smoke weed can often be a little bit breathier. Not always, but breathiness is like a great way to display a certain characteristic, right? Often that goes with a lower larynx. Breathiness with a high larynx. It's gets a little Rod Stewart. I didn't plan this, I swear. Anyway, so yeah, I've given you a bunch of tools and tips, and yeah, again, I probably spent like over $100,000 kind of piecing these things together. So here you go for free. Like, subscribe, comment, share.